Darwin. Somebody knocked on the door of the Major's cabin. On the step outside stood a very old man with long white hair and a beard. My name is Noah. This is a picture of all the animals that were saved from the flood. I forgot to mention that Marx lived the last 34 years of his life in London. He moved there in 1849 and died in 1883. All that time Charles Darwin was living just outside London. He died in 1882. Marx wanted to dedicate the English edition of his greatest work, Capital, to Darwin, but Darwin declined the honor. When Marx died the year after Darwin, his friend Friedrich Engels said, as Darwin discovered the theory of organic evolution, so Marx discovered the theory of mankind's historical evolution. Freud said that both Darwin's theory of evolution and his own psychoanalysis had resulted in an affront to mankind's naive egoism. A naturalistic current from the middle of the 19th century until quite far into our own. By naturalistic we mean a sense of reality that accepts no other reality than nature and the sensory world. A naturalist therefore also considers mankind to be part of nature. A naturalistic scientist will exclusively rely on natural phenomena, not on either rationalistic suppositions or any form of divine revelation. The key words from the middle of the last century were nature, environment, history, evolution, and growth. Marx had pointed out that human ideologies were a product of the basis of society. Darwin showed that mankind was the result of a slow biological evolution. Freud's studies of the unconscious revealed that people's actions were often the result of animal urges or instincts. Darwin had to distance himself from the Church's view of the creation of man and beast. Darwin, Shrewsbury in 1809. His father, Dr. Robert Darwin, was a renowned local physician, and very strict about his son's upbringing. When Charles was a pupil at the local grammar school, his headmaster described him as a boy who was always flying around, fooling about with stuff and nonsense, and never doing a stroke of anything that was the slightest bit useful. By useful, the headmaster meant cramming Greek and Latin verbs. By flying around, he was referring among other things to the fact that Charles clambered around collecting beetles of all kinds. I'll bet he came to regret those words. When he subsequently studied theology, Charles was far more interested in birdwatching and collecting insects, so he did not get very good grades in theology. In April 1831, he went to North Wales to study rock formations and to search for fossils. He received a letter which was to determine the course of his whole life. I have been requested to recommend a naturalist to go as companion to Captain Fitzroy, who has been commissioned by the government to survey the southern coasts of South America. It sailed from Plymouth on December 27, 1831, bound for South America, and it did not return until October of 1836. The 2 years became 5 and the voyage to South America turned into a voyage round the world. For the first years, the Beagle sailed up and down the coast of South America. Into the Galapagos Islands in the Pacific west of South America were of decisive significance as well. He was able to collect and send to England vast amounts of material. However, he kept his reflections on nature and the evolution of life to himself. When he returned home at the age of 27, he found himself renowned as a scientist. 1859, on the origin of species by means of natural selection, or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. Darwin advanced two theories or main theses. First, he proposed that all existing vegetable and animal forms were descended from earlier, more primitive forms by way of a biological evolution. Secondly, that evolution was the result of natural selection. The idea of biological evolution began to be widely accepted in some circles as early as 1800. The leading spokesman for this idea was the French zoologist Lamarck. Erasmus Darwin had suggested that plants and animals had evolved from some few primitive species. But none of them had come up with an acceptable explanation as to how this evolution happened. They were therefore not considered by churchmen to be any great threat. Both in ecclesiastic and scientific circles, the biblical doctrine of the immutability of all vegetable and animal species was strictly adhered to. Each and every form of animal life had been created separately once and for all. This Christian view was moreover in harmony with the teachings of Plato and Aristotle. Plato's theory of ideas presupposed that all animal species were immutable because they were made after patterns of eternal ideas or forms. The immutability of animal species was also one of the cornerstones of Aristotle's philosophy. But in Darwin's time there were a number of observations and finds which were putting traditional beliefs to the test. An increasing number of fossils were being dug out. There were also finds of large fossil bones from extinct animals. Darwin himself was puzzled to find traces of sea creatures far inland. In South America he made similar discoveries high up in the mountains of the Andes. Some believed that they had just been thrown away there by humans or animals. Others believed that God had created these fossils and traces of sea creatures to lead the ungodly astray. Most geologists swore to a catastrophe theory according to which the earth had been subjected to gigantic floods, earthquakes, and other catastrophes that had destroyed all life. We read of one of these in the Bible, the flood and Noah's Ark. After each catastrophe, God renewed life on Earth by creating new and more perfect plants and animals. It was thought that fossils were imprints of animals that had failed to get into the ark. Lyell held that the present geology of the Earth, with its mountains and valleys, was the result of an interminably long and gradual evolution. His point was that even quite small changes could cause huge geological upheavals, considering the eons of time that have elapsed. Like wind and weather, melting ice, earthquakes, and elevations of the ground level. But Darwin always remembered that tiny gradual changes could result in dramatic alterations if they were given sufficient time. A decisive factor in Lyell's theory was the age of the Earth. In Darwin's time, it was widely believed that about 6,000 years had elapsed since God created the Earth. That figure had been arrived at by counting the generations since Adam and Eve. Darwin figured the age of the Earth to be 300 million years. Because neither Lyell's theory of gradual geological evolution nor Darwin's own theory of evolution had any validity unless one reckoned with tremendously long periods of time. Today we know that the Earth is 4.6 billion years old. He stratified deposits of fossils in various layers of rock. Another argument was the geographic distribution of living species. He had seen with his own eyes that the individuals of a single species of animal within the same region could differ from each other in only the minutest detail. The Galapagos Islands are a compact group of volcanic islands. There were therefore no great differences in the plant and animal life there. But Darwin was interested in the tiny differences. On all the islands, he came across giant tortoises that were slightly different from one island to another. Observations of bird life on the Galapagos were even more striking. The Galapagos finches were clearly varied from island to island, especially as regards the shape of the beak. Darwin demonstrated that these variations were closely linked to the way the finches found their food on the different islands. Could all these finches be descended from one and the same species? And had the finches adapted to their surroundings on the different islands over the ages in such a way that new species of finches evolved? Had God once and for all really created all these animals slightly different from each other, or had an evolution taken place? Increasingly, he began to doubt that all species were immutable. But there was one more factor to indicate that all the animals on Earth might be related. The development of the embryo in mammals. If you compare the embryos of dogs, bats, rabbits, and humans at an early stage, they look so alike that it is hard to tell the difference. Shouldn't this indicate that we are distant relatives? He was familiar with the theory of the French zoologist Lamarck, who had shown that the different species had developed the characteristics they needed. Lamarck believed that the characteristics each individual acquires through his own efforts are passed on to the next generation. But this theory of the heredity of acquired characteristics was rejected by Darwin because Lamarck had no proof of his bold claims. So I ask, if you had 3 cows, but only enough fodder to keep 2 of them alive, what would you do? I suppose I'd slaughter the one that gave the least milk. Breeders have made an artificial selection. The same applies to the vegetable kingdom. You don't plant bad potatoes if there are good seed potatoes available, and you don't waste time cutting wheat that yields no grain. Darwin pointed out that no cows, no stalks of wheat, no dogs, and no finches are completely alike. Nature produces an enormous breadth of variation. Even within the same species, no 2 individuals are exactly alike. Is it possible that nature makes a natural selection as to which individuals are to survive? And could such a selection over a very long period of time create new species of flora and fauna? In October 1838, he chanced to come across a little book by Thomas Malthus. The book was called An Essay on the Principle of Population. Franklin had made the point that if there were no limiting factors in nature, one single species of plant or animal would spread over the entire globe. But because there are many species, they keep each other in balance. Malthus developed this idea and applied it to the world's population. He believed that mankind's ability to procreate is so great that there are always more children born than can survive. Since the production of food can never keep pace with the increase in population, he believed that huge numbers were destined to succumb in the struggle for existence. Those who survived to grow up and perpetuate the race would therefore be those who came out best in the struggle for survival. Here was the explanation of how evolution happens. It was due to natural selection in the struggle for life, in which those that were best adapted to their surroundings would survive and perpetuate the race. This was the second theory which he proposed in The Origin of Species. He wrote, "The elephant is reckoned the slowest breeder of all known animals, but if it had 6 young and survived to 100, after a period of from 740 to 750 years there would be nearly 19 million elephants alive, descended from the first pair." Darwin further proposed that the struggle for survival is frequently hardest among species that resemble each other the most. They have to fight for the same food. There, the slightest advantage, that is to say, the infinitesimal variation, truly comes into its own. The more bitter the struggle for survival, the quicker will be the evolution of new species, so that only the very best adapted will survive and the others will die out. But it's not only a question of food. It can be just as vital to avoid being eaten by other animals, to have a protective camouflage, the ability to run swiftly, to recognize hostile animals, or to have a repellent taste. The ability to reproduce is also of fundamental importance, obviously. The bull's sole purpose in life is to grow to sexual maturity and reproduce in order to propagate the race. It is rather like a relay race. Those that for one reason or another are unable to pass on their genes are continually discarded, and in that way the race is continually refined. Resistance to disease is one of the most important characteristics progressively accumulated and preserved in the variants that survive. The result of this continual selection is that the ones best adapted to a particular environment or a particular ecological niche will in the long term perpetuate the race in that environment. But what is an advantage in one environment is not necessarily an advantage in another. For some of the Galapagos finches, the ability to fly was vital. But being good at flying is not so necessary if food is dug from the ground and there are no predators. The reason why so many different animal species have arisen over the ages is precisely because of these many niches in the natural environment. But even so, there is only one human race. That's because man has a unique ability to adapt to different conditions of life. Those who live near the equator have darker skins than people in the more northerly climes because their dark skin protects them from the sun. White people who expose themselves to the sun for long periods are more prone to skin cancer. White skin more easily forms sun vitamins, and that can be vital in areas with very little sun. But nothing in nature is random. Everything is due to infinitesimal changes that have taken effect over countless generations. Sum up, we can say that the raw material behind the evolution of life on Earth was the continual variation of individuals within the same species, plus the large number of progeny, which meant that only a fraction of them survived. The actual mechanism, or driving force, behind evolution was thus the natural selection in the struggle for survival. This selection ensured that the strongest, or the fittest, survived. The church protested vehemently and the scientific world was sharply divided. Darwin had, after all, distanced God a good way from the act of creation, although there were admittedly some who claimed it was surely greater to have created something with its own innate evolutionary potential than simply to create a fixed entity. "Look out there," she cried. Down by the lake a man and a woman were walking hand in hand. They were completely naked. "That's Adam and Eve," said Alberto. They were gradually forced to throw in their lot with Little Red Riding Hood and Alice in Wonderland. But they soon disappeared among the trees. Because Darwin believed that mankind was descended from animals. In 1871 Darwin published The Descent of Man, in which he drew attention to the great similarities between humans and animals, advancing the theory that men and anthropoid apes must at one time have evolved from the same progenitor. By this time the first fossil skulls of an extinct type of man had been found, first in the Rock of Gibraltar and some years later in Neanderthal in Germany. Darwin died in 1882, he was buried with all the ceremony due to a pioneer of science. While alive, he had been described as the most dangerous man in England. People were suddenly obliged to revise their whole approach to the book of Genesis. The essence of Darwin's theory was the utterly random variations which had finally produced man. Did Darwin have anything to say about how such random variations arose? Darwin had only the vaguest idea of heredity. Something happens in the crossing. A father and mother never get two identical offspring. There is always some slight difference. On the other hand, it's difficult to produce anything really new in that way. Moreover, there are plants and animals which reproduce by budding or by simple cell division. On the question of how the variations arise, Darwin's theory has been supplemented by the so-called neo-Darwinism. All life and all reproduction is basically a matter of cell division. When a cell divides into two identical cells are produced with exactly the same hereditary factors. In cell division, then, we say a cell copies itself. But occasionally, infinitesimal errors occur in the process, so that the copied cell is not exactly the same as the mother cell. In modern biological terms, this is a mutation. Mutations are either totally irrelevant, or they can lead to marked changes in the behavior of the individual. They can be directly harmful, and such mutants will be continually discarded from the large broods. Many diseases are in fact due to mutations. But sometimes a mutation can give an individual just that extra positive characteristic needed to hold its own in the struggle for existence. Lamarck's explanation of why the giraffe has such a long neck was that giraffes have always had to reach upwards. But according to Darwinism, no such inherited characteristic would be passed on. Darwin believed that the giraffe's long neck was the result of a variation. Neo-Darwinism supplemented this by showing a clear cause of just that particular variation. Mutations. The giraffe that could reach up highest in the trees managed best. In Britain there is peppered moth, which lives on the trunks of silver birches. Back in the 18th century, most peppered moths were silvery gray. But from time to time, due to quite chance mutations, some darker ones were born. In several places, the silvery trunks became blackened by industrial soot. The darker ones survived best. The white losers were weeded out with the help of the birds as soon as they appeared on the birch trunks. But then, a decrease in the use of coal and better filtering equipment in the factories has recently produced a cleaner environment. And therefore the peppered moth is in the process of returning to its silvery color. This is what we call adaptation. It's a natural law. People have tried to eradicate pests with various pesticides. At first, this can produce excellent results. But due to continual mutations, a type of pest develops that is resistant to the pesticide being used. Now these winners have free play, so it becomes harder and harder to combat certain kinds of pests simply because of man's attempt to eradicate them. As we continue to administer penicillin, we are making certain bacteria resistant, thereby cultivating a group of bacteria that is much harder to combat than it was before. We find we have to use stronger and stronger antibiotics, until they finally crawl out of our mouths. But it is clear that modern medicine has created a serious dilemma. Modern medicine has put natural selection out of commission. Something that has helped one individual over a serious illness can in the long run contribute to weakening the resistance of the whole human race to certain diseases. If we pay absolutely no attention to what is called hereditary hygiene, we could find ourselves facing a degeneration of the human race. Mankind's hereditary potential for resisting serious disease will be weakened. Another summary. Those that have lost in the struggle for existence have disappeared, you see. It takes many millions of years to select the winning numbers for each and every species of vegetable and animal on the earth. And the losing numbers, well, they only make one appearance. So there are no species of animal or vegetable in existence today that are not winning numbers in the great lottery of life. And now, if you will kindly pass me the picture which that fellow that zookeeper brought us. The picture of Noah's Ark covered one side of it. The other was devoted to a tree diagram of all the various species of animals. Our Darwinian Noah also brought us a sketch that shows the distribution of the various vegetable and animal species. You can see how the different species belong in the different groups, classes, and subkingdoms. Together with monkeys, man belongs to the so-called primates. Primates are mammals, and all mammals belong to the vertebrates, which again belong to the multicellular animals. Birds at some point parted from reptiles, and that reptiles at some point parted from amphibia, and that amphibia parted from fishes. Every time a line divides into two, it's because mutations have resulted in a new species. That is how, over the ages, the different classes and subkingdoms of animals arose. In actual fact, there are more than 1 million animal species in the world today, and this million is only a fraction of the species that have at some time lived on the earth. In all probability, plants come from the same primal cell as animals. Where did this first primal cell come from? If, and oh, what an if, we could picture some hot little pool in which all manner of ammoniacal and phosphorus salts, light, heat, electricity, and so forth were present, and that a protein compound were to be chemically formed in it, ready to undergo even more complicated changes. Darwin was philosophizing on here was how the first living cell might have been formed out of inorganic matter. And again, he hit the nail right on the head. Scientists of today think the first primitive form of life arose in precisely the kind of hot little pool that Darwin pictured. Let us first establish that all life on Earth, both animal and vegetable, is constructed of exactly the same substances. The simplest definition of life is that it is a substance which in a nutrient solution has the ability to subdivide itself into two identical parts. This process is governed by a substance we call DNA. By DNA we mean the chromosomes, or hereditary structures, that are found in all living cells. We also use the term DNA molecule, because DNA is in fact a complex molecule or macromolecule. The question is, then, how the first molecule arose. The Earth was formed when the solar system came into being 4.6 billion years ago. It began as a glowing mass which gradually cooled. This is where modern science believes life began between 3 and 4 billion years ago. Our planet was quite different from the way it looks today. Since there was no life, there was no oxygen in the atmosphere. Free oxygen was first formed by the photosynthesis of plants. And the fact that there was no oxygen is important. It is unlikely that life cells which, again, can form DNA could have arisen in an atmosphere containing oxygen. Why? Because oxygen is strongly reactive. Long before complex molecules like DNA could be formed, the DNA molecular cells would be oxidized. Really? That is how we know for certain that no new life arises today, not even so much as a bacterium or a virus. All life on Earth must be exactly the same age. An elephant has just as long a family tree as the smallest bacterium. You could almost say that an elephant or a human being is in reality a single coherent colony of monocellular creatures. Because each cell in our body carries the same hereditary material. The whole recipe of who we are lies hidden in each tiny cell. One of life's great mysteries is that the cells of a multicellular animal have the ability to specialize their function in spite of the fact that not all the different hereditary characteristics are active in all the cells. Some of these characteristics or genes are activated and others are deactivated. A liver cell does not produce the same proteins as a nerve cell or a skin cell. But all three types of cell have the same DNA molecule, which contains the whole recipe for the organism in question. Since there was no oxygen in the atmosphere, there was no protective ozone layer around the Earth. That means there was nothing to stop the radiation from the cosmos. This is also significant because this radiation was probably instrumental in forming the first complex molecule. Cosmic radiation of this nature was the actual energy which caused the various chemical substances on the Earth to start combining into a complicated macromolecule. Let me recapitulate: before such complex molecules, of which all life consists, can be formed, at least two conditions must be present: there must be no oxygen in the atmosphere, and there must be access for cosmic radiation. In this hot little pool or primal soup, as it is often called by modern scientists, there was once formed a gigantically complicated macromolecule, which had the wondrous property of being able to subdivide itself into two identical parts. And so the long evolutionary process began, the first DNA or the first living cell. It subdivided itself again and again, but from the very first stage, transmutation was occurring. After eons of time, one of these monocellular organisms connected with a more complicated multicellular organism. Thus the photosynthesis of plants also began, and in that way the atmosphere came to contain oxygen. This had two results: first, the atmosphere permitted the evolution of animals that could breathe with the aid of lungs. Secondly, the atmosphere protected life from the harmful cosmic radiation. Strangely enough, this radiation, which was probably a vital spark in the formation of the first cell, is also harmful to all forms of life. But the atmosphere can't have been formed overnight. How did the earliest forms of life manage? Life began in the primal seas, which are what we mean by primal soup. There it could live protected from the harmful rays. Not until much later, when life in the oceans had formed an atmosphere, did the first amphibians crawl out onto land. The rest is what we have already talked about. The picture on this board shows that evolution had a direction. Across the eons of time, animals have evolved with increasingly complicated nerve systems and an ever bigger brain. Personally, I don't think that can be accidental. What do you think? Darwin couldn't really come to terms with the fact that something as delicate and sensitive as an eye could be exclusively due to natural selection. Suddenly she exclaimed, "What matters our creative endless toil? When, at a snatch, oblivion ends the coil." Those are the words of the devil. Or Mephistopheles in Goethe's Faust. As Faust dies and looks back on his life's work, he says in triumph, "Then to the moment could I say, linger you now, you are so fair. Now records of my earthly day no flights of eons can impair, for knowledge comes, and fills me with such bliss, I take my joy, my highest moment this." But then it's the devil's turn. As soon as Faust dies, he exclaims, "A foolish word, bygone." How so then? Gone. Gone, to sheer nothing, past with null made one. What matters creative endless toil, when, at a snatch, oblivion ends the coil? It is bygone. How shall this riddle run? As good as if things never had begun, yet circle back, existence to possess, I'd rather have eternal emptiness. Even though his life was over, Faust saw some meaning in the traces he would leave behind him. And is it not also a consequence of Darwin's theory that we are part of something all-encompassing, in which every tiny life form has its significance in the big picture? We are the living planet, Sophie. We are the great vessel sailing around a burning sun in the universe. But each and every one of us is also a ship sailing through life with a cargo of genes. When we have carried this cargo safely to the next harbor, we have not lived in vain. Thomas Hardy expresses the same thought in his poem Transformations. Portion of this you is a man my grandsire knew, bosomed here at its foot, this branch may be his wife, a ruddy human life now turned to a green shoot. These grasses must be made of her who often prayed, last century, for repose, and the fair girl long ago whom I often tried to know may be entering this rose. So, they are not underground, but as nerves and veins abound in the growths of upper air, and they feel the sun and rain, and the energy again that made them what they were. Freud. Hilda ran out of the house, down the garden, and out onto the little dock. She untied the boat and jumped down into it. We are the living planet, Sophie. We are the great vessel sailing around a burning sun in the universe. But each and every of us is also a ship sailing through life with a cargo of genes. When we have carried this cargo safely to the next harbor, we have not lived in vain. She knew the passage by heart. It had been written for her. Not for Sophie, for her. Every word in the ring binder was written by Dad to Hilda. Where were Sophie and Alberto in this picture? Yes, where were Alberto and Sophie? She could not fathom that they were no more than electromagnetic impulses in her father's brain. She could not fathom, and certainly not accept, that they were only paper and printer's ink from a ribbon in her father's portable typewriter. One might just as well say that she herself was nothing but a conglomeration of protein compounds that had suddenly come to life one day in a hot little pool. But she was more than that. She did not start to read again until the evening. Once again there was a knocking on the door. On the step stood a naked man. "Well," he said. "What do you good people think of the Emperor's new clothes?" Covering his private parts with both hands, he bounded toward the nearest clump of trees and disappeared. A few words about Sigmund Freud. Freud, 1856. He specialized early on in neurology. He developed his depth psychology or psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis is a description of the human mind in general as well as a therapy for nervous and mental disorders. His theory of the unconscious is necessary to an understanding of what a human being is. Freud held that there is a constant tension between man and his surroundings. In particular, a tension or conflict between his drives and needs and the demands of society. Freud discovered human drives. This makes him an important exponent of the naturalistic currents. Human drives. Our actions are not always guided by reason. Man is not really such a rational creature as the 18th century rationalists like to think. Irrational impulses often determine what we think, what we dream, and what we do. Such irrational impulses can be an expression of basic drives or needs. The human sexual drive, for example, is just as basic as the baby's instinct to suckle. Freud showed that these basic needs can be disguised or sublimated, thereby steering our actions without our being aware of it. He also showed that infants have some sort of sexuality. We call it Victorianism, when everything to do with sexuality is taboo. Freud first became aware of children's sexuality during his practice of psychotherapy. He had also seen how numerous forms of neurosis or psychological disorders could be traced back to conflicts during childhood. He gradually developed a type of therapy that we could call the archaeology of the soul. The psychoanalyst, with the patient's help, can dig deep into the patient's mind and bring to light the experiences that have caused the patient's psychological disorder, since according to Freud, we store the memory of all our experiences deep inside us. The analyst can perhaps discover an unhappy experience that the patient has tried to suppress for many years, but which has nevertheless lain buried, gnawing away at the patient's resources. By bringing a traumatic experience into the conscious mind and holding it up to the patient, so to speak, he or she can help the patient be done with it, and get well again. Description of the human mind. When we come into the world, we live out our physical and mental needs quite directly and unashamedly. We also give direct expression to our desire for physical contact and body warmth. Freud called this pleasure principle in us the ID. As newborn babies we are hardly anything but ID. We carry the ID, or pleasure principle, with us into adulthood and throughout life. But gradually we learn to regulate our desires and adjust to our surroundings. We learn to regulate the pleasure principle in relation to the reality principle. In Freud's terms, we develop an ego which has this regulative function. Even though we want or need something, we cannot just lie down and scream until we get what we want or need. We may repress our desires. That means we try to push them away and forget about them. Freud proposed a third element in the human mind. From infancy we are constantly faced with the moral demands of our parents and of society. When we do anything wrong, our parents say don't do that, or naughty naughty, that's bad. Even when we are grown up, we retain the echo of such moral demands and judgments. It seems as though the world's moral expectations have become part of us. Freud called this the superego. Conscience is a component of the superego. But Freud claimed that the superego tells us when our desires themselves are bad or improper, not least in the case of erotic or sexual desire. Freud claimed that these improper desires already manifest themselves at an early stage of childhood. Nowadays we know that infants like touching their sex organs. It could result in a naughty, or don't do that. That's the beginning of guilt feelings about everything connected with the sex organs and sexuality. Because this guilt feeling remains in the superego, many people, according to Freud, most people feel guilty about sex all their lives. At the same time he showed that sexual desires and needs are natural and vital for human beings. And thus the stage is set for a lifelong conflict between desire and guilt. Many of Freud's patients experienced the conflict so acutely that they developed what Freud called neuroses. Buried it deep in her unconscious. Human psyche, Freud concluded that the conscious constitutes only a small part of the human mind. Below the threshold of the conscious is the subconscious, or the unconscious. We don't have all our experiences consciously present all the time. But the kinds of things we have thought or experienced, and which we can recall if we put our mind to it, Freud termed the preconscious. He reserved the term unconscious for things we have repressed we try to forget because it was either unpleasant, improper, or nasty. If we have desires and urges that are not tolerable to the conscious, the superego shoves them downstairs. For some people, to keep the unpleasant or forbidden thoughts away from consciousness, that it leads to mental illness. Whatever is repressed in this way will try of its own accord to re-enter consciousness. We live under the constant pressure of repressed thoughts that are trying to fight their way up from the unconscious. That's why we often say or do things without intending to. Unconscious reactions thus prompt our feelings and actions. One is what he called parapraxis, slips of the tongue or pen. We accidentally say or do things that we once tried to repress. Another thing we can do is to rationalize. That means that we do not give the real reason for what we are doing either to ourselves or to other people because the real reason is unacceptable. I could hypnotize you to open a window. While you are under hypnosis, I tell you that when I begin to drum my fingers on the table you will get up and open the window. I drum on the table and you open the window. Afterward I ask you why you opened the window and you might say you did it because it was too hot. But that is not the real reason. You are reluctant to admit to yourself that you did something under my hypnotic orders. So you rationalize. When we project, we transfer the characteristics we are trying to repress in ourselves onto other people. A person who is very miserly, for example, will characterize others as penny pinchers. And someone who will not admit to being preoccupied with sex can be the first to be incensed at other people's sex fixation. Freud's point was that these slips are neither as accidental nor as innocent as we think. These bungled actions can in fact reveal the most intimate secrets. You won't be able to escape from your unconscious impulses. The art is precisely not to expend too much effort on burying unpleasant things in the unconscious. It is actually quite healthy to leave the door ajar between the conscious and the unconscious. A neurotic is just such a person, who uses too much energy trying to keep the unpleasant out of his consciousness. Frequently there is a particular experience which the person is desperately trying to repress. Freud developed a technique which he called free association. In other words, he let the patient lie in a relaxed position and just talk about whatever came into his or her mind. The idea was to break through the lid or control that had grown over the traumas, because it was these traumas that were causing the patient concern. They are active all the time, just not consciously. The harder you try to forget something, the more you think about it unconsciously. According to Freud, the royal road to the unconscious is our dreams. In the interpretation of dreams he showed that our dreams are not random. Our unconscious tries to communicate with our conscious through dreams. Freud determined that all dreams are wish fulfillments. In adults, the wishes that are to be fulfilled in dreams are disguised. That is because even when we sleep, censorship is at work on what we will permit ourselves. Freud showed that we must distinguish between the actual dream as we recall it in the morning and the real meaning of the dream. He termed the actual dream image, that is, the film or video we dream, the manifest dream. This apparent dream content always takes its material or scenario from the previous day. But the dream also contains a deeper meaning which is hidden from consciousness. Freud called this the latent dream thoughts, and these hidden thoughts which the dream is really about may stem from the distant past, from earliest childhood, for instance. But it is not the doctor who interprets the dream. He can only do it with the help of the patient. The dream work. We might call it masking or coding what the dream is actually about. In interpreting the dream, we must go through the reverse process and unmask or decode the motif to arrive at its theme. Freud believed that the dream was a disguised fulfillment of a repressed wish. Freud's psychoanalysis was extremely important in the 1920s, especially for the treatment of certain psychiatric patients. His theory of the unconscious was also very significant for art and literature. Poets and painters, especially the surrealists, attempted to exploit the power of the unconscious in their work. The word surrealism comes from the French, and means superrealism. In 1924 André Breton published a surrealistic manifesto, claiming that art should come from the unconscious. The artist should thus derive the freest possible inspiration from his dream images and strive toward a superrealism, in which the boundaries between dream and reality were dissolved. In order to interpret his patient's dreams, Freud often had to work his way through a dense language of symbols rather in the way we interpret a picture or a literary text. Recent research shows that we dream for about 20% of our sleeping hours, that is, between 1 and 2 hours each night. If we are disturbed during our dream phases we become nervous and irritable. His work with patients convinced him that we retain everything we have seen and experienced somewhere deep in our consciousness, and all these impressions can be brought to light again. Everything comes tumbling out by itself, and we can find all the words and images we need. This is when we have lifted the lid of the unconscious. We can call it inspiration. It feels as if what we are drawing or writing is coming from some outside source. And that's the way it goes when imagination gets strangled by reasoned deliberation. It is important for an artist to be able to let go. The surrealists tried to exploit this by putting themselves into a state where things just happened by themselves. They had a sheet of white paper in front of them and they began to write without thinking about what they wrote. They called it automatic writing. But perhaps there is an element of the unconscious in every creative process, for what do we actually mean by creativity? Happens in a delicate interplay between imagination and reason. But all too frequently, reason throttles the imagination, and that's serious because without imagination, nothing really new will ever be created. I believe imagination is like a Darwinian system. Well, Darwinism holds that nature's mutants arise one after the other, but only a few of them can be used. Only some of them get the right to live. That's how it is when we have an inspiration and get masses of new ideas. But only some of these thoughts can be used. Here, reason comes into its own. Imagine if everything that strikes us were allowed to pass our lips. Not to speak of jumping off our notepads out of our desk drawers. The world would sink under the weight of casual impulses and no selection would have taken place. So it's reason that chooses between all these ideas. Yes, don't you think so? Maybe the imagination creates what is new, but the imagination does not make the actual selection. The imagination does not compose. A composition and every work of art is created in a wondrous interplay between imagination and reason, or between mind and reflection. For there will always be an element of chance in the creative process. Sophie suddenly noticed a crowd of brightly colored Disney figures down by the lake. "There's Goofy," she exclaimed, "and Donald Duck and his nephews. Look, Alberto. There's Mickey Mouse and..." I was going to say something about the importance of imagination to us philosophers. In order to think new thoughts, we must be bold enough to let ourselves go. But right now, he's going a bit far. We have talked about dreams. There's a touch of irony about that too. For what are we but the Major's dream images? Maybe he is embarrassingly aware of his own dream. He is aware of everything we say and do just as the dreamer remembers the dream's manifest dream aspect. It is he who wields it with his pen. But even if he remembers everything we say to each other, he is still not quite awake. He does not know the latent dream thoughts, he forgets that this too is a disguised dream. The Major thinks so too. That is because he does not understand his own dream language. I'm going to dive down into the Major's unconscious. That's where I'll be until we meet again. Our own time. Could there be something she was trying to repress? What could Alberto be planning? Of course, it was Hilda's father planning that Alberto was planning something. Did he already know what Alberto would do? Should she take a peek at the last page? No, that would be cheating. Hilda had a few surprises up her own sleeve, in any case. Her father did not control her. But was she in full control of herself? What was consciousness? Wasn't it one of the greatest riddles of the universe? What was memory? What made us remember everything we had seen and experienced? She had dreamt that her father came home from Lebanon, and the whole dream was an extension of Sophie's dream when she found the gold crucifix on the dock. She heard a very soft voice whispering, "My name is Sophie." "Hilda. You must be both deaf and blind." Just then her father had come into the garden in his UN uniform. "Hilda," he shouted. Hilda ran up to him and threw her arms around his neck. That's where the dream ended. She remembered some lines of a poem by Arnulf Zero Verland, wakened one night by a curious dream and a voice that seemed to be speaking to me like a far-off subterranean stream. I rose and asked, "What do you want of me?" "I'm going to dive down into the Major's unconscious. That's where I'll be until we meet again." When Sophie left the Major's cabin, she could still see some of the Disney figures at the water's edge. She was working desperately to hold the Major's attention so that Alberto could sit undisturbed in the cabin. She tried once more to climb down but she was truly stuck. "My name is Morton," said the goose. "You look as if you could use some help getting down from this tree. I carried a peasant boy exactly your age all over Sweden. His name was Nils Holgersson. I gave him a little slap and he passed out. When he woke up, he was no bigger than a thumb. I presume this is a philosophy book, then. When I was flying over Sweden with Nils Holgersson, we touched down on Marbacka in Varmland, where Nils met an old woman who was planning to write a book about Sweden for school children. It was to be both instructive and true, she said. When she heard about Nils's adventures, she decided to write a book about all the things he had seen on Gooseback. That was very strange. To tell you the truth, it was rather ironic, because we were already in that book. Suddenly Sophie felt something slap her cheek and the next minute she had become no bigger than a thumb. It flew into land at the foot of the tree which Sophie had so recently begun to climb. As the goose touched down, Sophie tumbled onto the ground. After rolling around in the heather a few times, she sat up. She realized with amazement that she was her full size again. "I would have liked to fly you through the whole history of philosophy just as I flew Nils Holgersson through Sweden. We could have circled over Miletus and Athens, Jerusalem and Alexandria, Rome and Florence, London and Paris, Jena and Heidelberg, Berlin and Copenhagen." After dinner they began to get everything ready for the garden party. The last time they had used the trestle table had been on Sophie's parents' 10th anniversary. Sophie was only 8 years old at the time. The minute her mother had left the house, the telephone rang. It was Alberto. "We're already in our own century. From now on you should be able to orient yourself on your own. Can we meet at 12? Okay. Bye." A lot of other people were sitting at the round tables, but Sophie saw only that Alberto was not among them. She wondered what all these people thought about being alive. They looked as though they had simply dropped in, as though they had just sat down here by chance. Didn't look as though they were talking about anything that mattered. She suddenly came to think of Kierkegaard, who had said that what characterized the crowd most was their idle chatter. Were all these people living at the aesthetic stage? Or was there something that was existentially important to them? In one of his early letters to her, Alberto had talked about the similarity between children and philosophers. She realized again that she was afraid of becoming an adult. Suppose she too ended up crawling deep down into the fur of the white rabbit that was pulled out of the universe's top hat? Suddenly Alberto walked in. Let's talk about our own century. Existentialism, this is a collective term for several philosophical currents that take man's existential situation as their point of departure. Based their ideas on Kierkegaard, Hegel, and Marx. German Friedrich Nietzsche, 1844 to 1900. He, too, reacted against Hegel's philosophy and the German historicism. He proposed life itself as a counterweight to the anemic interest in history and what he called the Christian slave morality. He sought to effect a revaluation of all values, so that the life force of the strongest should not be hampered by the weak. According to Nietzsche, both Christianity and traditional philosophy had turned away from the real world and pointed toward heaven or the world of ideas. But what had hitherto been considered the real world was in fact a pseudo-world. Be true to the world, he said. Do not listen to those who offer you supernatural expectations. Influenced by both Kierkegaard and Nietzsche was the German existential philosopher Martin Heidegger. French existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre, 1905 to 1980. He became especially popular in the 40s, just after the war. Later on he allied himself with the Marxist movement in France. He met his lifelong companion Simone de Beauvoir in a café. She was also an existential philosopher. Sartre said that existentialism is humanism. By that he meant that the existentialists start from nothing but humanity itself. I might add that the humanism he was referring to took a far bleaker view of the human situation than the humanism we met in the Renaissance. Both Kierkegaard and some of this century's existential philosophers were Christian. But Sartre's allegiance was an atheistic existentialism. His philosophy can be seen as a merciless analysis of the human situation when God is dead. The expression God is dead came from Nietzsche. The key word in Sartre's philosophy, as in Kierkegaard's, is existence. But existence did not mean the same as being alive. Plants and animals are also alive, they exist, but they do not have to think about what it implies. Man is the only living creature that is conscious of its own existence. Sartre said that a material thing is simply in itself, but mankind is for itself. The being of man is therefore not the same as the being of things. Sartre said that man's existence takes priority over whatever he might otherwise be. The fact that I exist takes priority over what I am. Existence takes priority over essence. By essence we mean that which something consists of the nature, or being, of something. But according to Sartre, man has no such innate nature. Man must therefore create himself. He must create his own nature or essence, because it is not fixed in advance. Philosophers have sought to discover what man is or what human nature is. But Sartre believed that man has no such eternal nature to fall back on. It is therefore useless to search for the meaning of life in general. We are condemned to improvise. We are like actors dragged onto the stage without having learned our lines, with no script and no prompter to whisper stage directions to us. We must decide for ourselves how to live. When people realize they are alive and will one day die and there is no meaning to cling to, they experience angst, said Sartre. You may recall that angst, a sense of dread, was also characteristic of Kierkegaard's description of a person in an existential situation. Sartre says that man feels alien in a world without meaning. When he describes man's alienation, he is echoing the central ideas of Hegel and Marx. Man's feeling of alienation in the world creates a sense of despair, boredom, nausea, and absurdity. Sartre was describing the 20th century city dweller. You remember that the Renaissance humanists had drawn attention, almost triumphantly, to man's freedom and independence. Sartre experienced man's freedom as a curse. Man is condemned to be free, he said. Condemned because he has not created himself and is nevertheless free. Because having once been hurled into the world, he is responsible for everything he does. Nevertheless we are free individuals, and this freedom condemns us to make choices throughout our lives. There are no eternal values or norms we can adhere to, which makes our choices even more significant. Because we are totally responsible for everything we do. Sartre emphasized that man must never disclaim the responsibility for his actions. Nor can we avoid the responsibility of making our own choices on the grounds that we must go to work, or we must live up to certain middle-class expectations regarding how we should live. Those who thus slip into the anonymous masses will never be other than members of the impersonal flock, having fled from themselves into self-deception. On the other hand, our freedom obliges us to make something of ourselves, to live authentically or truly. This is not least the case as regards our ethical choices. We can never lay the blame on human nature, or human frailty or anything like that. Now and then it happens that grown men behave like pigs and then blame it on the old Adam. But there is no old Adam. He is merely a figure we clutch at to avoid taking responsibility for our own actions. Sartre claimed there was no innate meaning to life. He did not mean that nothing mattered. He was not what we call a nihilist. That is a person who thinks nothing means anything and everything is permissible. Sartre believed that life must have meaning. It is an imperative. But it is we ourselves who must create this meaning in our own lives. To exist is to create your own life. Sartre tried to prove that consciousness in itself is nothing until it has perceived something. Because consciousness is always conscious of something. And this something is provided just as much by ourselves as by our surroundings. We are partly instrumental in deciding what we perceive by selecting what is significant for us. Two people can be present in the same room and yet experience it quite differently. This is because we contribute our own meaning or our own interests when we perceive our surroundings. An escaped convict may see policemen everywhere. Our own lives influence the way we perceive things in the room. If something is of no interest to me, I don't see it. We annihilate whatever is irrelevant for us. They are unimportant to you. You might find them aggravating, unpleasant even. They are taking up far too much room. The only thing you register is that he is not there. Simone de Beauvoir attempted to apply existentialism to feminism. Sartre had already said that man has no basic nature to fall back on. We create ourselves. Simone de Beauvoir denied the existence of a basic female nature or male nature. For instance, it has been generally claimed that man has a transcending, or achieving, nature. He will therefore seek meaning and direction outside the home. Woman has been said to have the opposite life philosophy. She is immanent, which means she wishes to be where she is. She will therefore nurture her family, care for the environment and more homely things. Simone de Beauvoir in fact did not believe in the existence of any such female nature or male nature. On the contrary, she believed that women and men must liberate themselves from such ingrown prejudices or ideals. Her main work, published in 1949, was called The Second Sex. She was talking about women. In our culture, women are treated as the second sex. Men behave as if they are the subjects, treating women like their objects, thus depriving them of the responsibility for their own life. She meant we women are exactly as free and independent as we choose to be. Existentialism also had a great influence on literature, from the 40s to the present day, especially on drama. Their characteristic style, and that of many other modern writers, was what we call absurdism. The term is especially used about the theater of the absurd. The theater of the absurd represented a contrast to realistic theater. Its aim was to show the lack of meaning in life in order to get the audience to disagree. The idea was not to cultivate the meaningless. On the contrary. But by showing and exposing the absurd in ordinary everyday situations, the onlookers are forced to seek a truer and more essential life for themselves. The theater of the absurd often portrays situations that are absolutely trivial. It can therefore also be called a kind of hyperrealism. People are portrayed precisely as they are. But if you reproduce on stage exactly what goes on in the bathroom on a perfectly ordinary morning in a perfectly ordinary home, the audience would laugh. Their laughter could be interpreted as a defense mechanism against seeing themselves lampooned on stage. The absurd theater can also have certain surrealistic features. Its characters often find themselves in highly unrealistic and dreamlike situations. When they accept this without surprise, the audience is compelled to react in surprise at the character's lack of surprise. This was how Charlie Chaplin worked in his silent movies. Acceptance of all the absurd things that happened to him. That compelled the audience to look into themselves for something more genuine and true. At times it can be right to feel, this is something I must get away from even though I don't have any idea where to go. Neo-Thomism, that is to say ideas which belong to the tradition of Thomas Aquinas. Analytical philosophy or logical empiricism, with roots reaching back to Hume and British empiricism, and even to the logic of Aristotle. Neo-Marxism in a myriad of various strands. We have already talked about Neo-Darwinism and the significance of psychoanalysis. Materialism, which also has historical roots. A lot of current science can be traced back to the efforts of the pre-Socratics. For example, the search for the indivisible elemental particle of which all matter is composed. No one has yet been able to give a satisfactory explanation of what matter is. Modern sciences such as nuclear physics and biochemistry are so fascinated by the problem that for many people it constitutes a vital part of their life's philosophy. Sartre made an important observation when he said that existential questions cannot be answered once and for all. A philosophical question is by definition something that each generation, each individual even, must ask over and over again. It is by asking such questions that we know we are alive. And while people were seeking answers to the ultimate questions, they have discovered clear and final solutions to many other problems. Science, research, and technology are all byproducts of our philosophical reflection. Was it not our wonder about life that finally brought men to the moon? One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. With these words he summed up how it felt to be the first man to set foot on the moon, drawing with him all the people who had lived before him. It was not his merit alone, obviously. The most serious problems of today are those of the environment. A central philosophical direction in the 20th century is therefore ecophilosophy or ecosophy, Arne Nies has called it. Have warned that Western civilization as a whole is on a fundamentally wrong track, racing toward a head-on collision with the limits of what our planet can tolerate. They have tried to take soundings that go deeper than the concrete effects of pollution and environmental destruction. Ecophilosophy has questioned the very idea of evolution in its assumption that man is at the top as if we are masters of nature. This way of thinking could prove to be fatal for the whole living planet. Ecophilosophers have looked to the thinking and ideas in other cultures such as those of India. They have also studied the thoughts and customs of so-called primitive peoples or native peoples such as the Native Americans in order to rediscover what we have lost. In scientific circles in recent years it has been said that our whole mode of scientific thought is facing a paradigm shift. This has already borne fruit in several fields. We have witnessed numerous examples of so-called alternative movements advocating holism and a new lifestyle. However, when there are many people involved, one must always distinguish between good and bad. Some proclaim that we are entering a new age. But everything new is not necessarily good, and not all the old should be thrown out. That is one of the reasons why I have given you this course in philosophy. Now you have the historical background, you can orient yourself in life. I think you will find that much of what marches under the New Age banner is humbug. Even the so-called new religion, new occultism, and modern superstitions of all kinds have influenced the Western world in recent decades. It has become an industry. Alternative offers on the philosophical market have mushroomed in the wake of the dwindling support for Christianity. But why don't we take a stroll through town? There's something I'd like you to see. We just have to round off Hilda's philosophy course first. The major hasn't thought beyond that, you see. So he loses some of his mastery over us. They walked past a big store that sold everything in communication technology. Alberto pointed to the window display and said, "There you have the 20th century, Sophie. In the Renaissance the world began to explode, so to speak. Beginning with the great voyages of discovery, Europeans started to travel all over the world. Today it's the opposite. We could call it an explosion in reverse. The world is becoming drawn together into one great communications network. The question is whether history is coming to an end or whether on the contrary we are on the threshold of a completely new age. We are no longer simply citizens of a city or of a particular country. We live in a planetary civilization." A picture of some UN soldiers flashed onto a TV screen. The camera zoomed in on one of the UN soldiers. He had a black beard almost identical to Alberto's. Suddenly he held up a piece of card on which was written, "Back soon, Hilda." He waved and was gone. They stopped in front of Libra's, the biggest bookstore in town. It had 3 sections, New Age, Alternative Lifestyles, and Mysticism. Books such as Life After Death, The Secrets of Spiritism, Tarot, The UFO Phenomenon, Healing, The Return of the Gods, You Have Been Here Before, and What is Astrology. Much of it is humbug. But it sells as well as pornography. A lot of it is a kind of pornography. Young people can come here and purchase the ideas that fascinate them most. But the difference between real philosophy and these books is more or less the same as the difference between real love and pornography. It's called ESP or parapsychology, said Alberto. Or it's called telepathy, clairvoyance, and psychokinetics. It's called spiritism, astrology, and urology. These subjects together possibly chart a fairly detailed map of a landscape that does not exist. And there are many figments of the imagination here that Hume would have committed to the flames. Many of those books do not contain so much as one iota of genuine experience. Publishing such books is a big commercial enterprise. It's what most people want. They obviously desire something mystical, something different to break the dreary monotony of everyday life. But it is like carrying coals to Newcastle. Here we are, wandering around in a wonderful adventure. A work of creation is emerging in front of our very eyes. Why should we enter the fortune teller's tent or the backyards of academe in search of something exciting or transcendental? Here, too, we are talking about a Darwinian system. Now and then you experience a strange coincidence. You might go into a store and buy something for 28 crowns. Later on that day Joanna comes along and gives you the 28 crowns she owes you. You both decide to go to the movies and you get seat number 28. It would be a coincidence, anyway. The point is, people collect coincidences like these. They collect strange or inexplicable experiences. When such experiences taken from the lives of billions of people are assembled into books, it begins to look like genuine data. And the amount of it increases all the time. But once again we are looking at a lottery in which only the winning numbers are visible. If we exclude the phonies, we find another explanation for these so-called mysterious experiences. Freud's theory of the unconscious. Freud showed that we can often serve as mediums for our own unconscious. We might suddenly find ourselves thinking or doing something without really knowing why. The reason is that we have a whole lot of experiences, thoughts, and memories inside us that we are not aware of. People sometimes talk or walk in their sleep. We could call this a sort of mental automatism. Also under hypnosis, people can say and do things not of their own volition. And remember the surrealists trying to produce so-called automatic writing. They were just trying to serve as mediums for their own unconscious. From time to time during the century there have been what are called spiritualist revivals, the idea being that a medium could get into contact with a deceased person. Either by speaking in the voice of the deceased, or by using automatic writing, the medium would receive a message from someone who had lived 5 or 50 or many hundreds of years ago. This has been taken as evidence either that there is life after death or that we live many lives. I'm not saying that all mediums have been fakes. Some have clearly been in good faith. They really have been mediums, but they have only been mediums for their own unconscious. It just shows what an incredible capacity some people have to store experience in their unconscious. I might suddenly get a call from a friend I haven't heard from for many years just as I had begun to look for his telephone number, but the explanation could be that we both heard the same old song on the radio, a song we heard the last time we were together. The point is, we are not aware of the underlying connection. It's healthier to approach such books with a decent portion of skepticism. Not least if one is a philosopher. On the other hand, there is a lot we humans don't understand. Maybe we don't understand the laws of nature either. Even the term supernatural is a curious one. No, I suppose I believe that there is only one nature. But that, on the other hand, is absolutely astonishing. And one day, even a skeptic like me could be obliged to accept a phenomenon I did not believe in before. If I did not keep this possibility open I would be dogmatic, and not a true philosopher. But before we part, I'll show you a white crow. It is nearer than we think, you see. Alberto pointed down at a particular book, and Sophie gasped as she read the title, Sophie's World. Shortly afterward, however, she was on her way home with the book in one hand and a little bag of things for the garden party in the other. The garden party. Hilda sat on the bed, transfixed. And what she had been through these last 2 hours. It started with Sophie trying to attract the Major's attention on the way home from the cabin in the woods. She had finally climbed a tree and been rescued by Morton Goose, who had arrived like a guardian angel from Lebanon. Hilda had never forgotten how her father had read the wonderful adventures of Nils to her. She and her father had had a secret language together that was connected with the book. Then Sophie had her first experience as a lone customer in a cafe. Hilda had been especially taken with what Alberto said about Sartre and existentialism. Once, about a year ago, Hilda had bought a book on astrology. Another time she had come home with a set of tarot cards. Next time it was a book on spiritualism. Each time, her father had lectured her about superstition and her critical faculty, but he had waited until now for the final blow. His counterattack was deadly accurate. To be absolutely sure, he had waved to her from a TV screen in a radio store. Sophie, who are you? Where do you come from? Why have you come into my life? Finally Sophie had been given a book about herself. Was it the same book that Hilda now had in her hands? This was only a ring binder. But even so, how could one find a book about oneself in a book about oneself? What would happen if Sophie began to read that book? What was going to happen now? What could happen now? There were only a few pages left in her ring binder. Sophie met her mother on the bus on her way home from town. You bought a book? No, not exactly. Sophie's World, how curious. I just want to take a peek at the first page, okay. Sophie Amundsen was on her way home from school. She had walked the first part of the way with Joanna. They had been discussing robots. It's written by someone called Albert Nag. He must be a newcomer. What's your Alberto's name, by the way? Knox. It'll probably turn out that this extraordinary person has written a whole book about you, Sophie. It's called Using a Pseudonym. Albert Nag lives in a completely different reality. That's why this book is a white crow. They ran straight into a demonstration. There were no more than about 10 or 12 people. Their banners read, "The Major is at hand, yes to yummy midsummer eats, more power to the UN." You should be surprised that you're not surprised, at any rate. Sophie. I don't think I believe in real philosophers any longer. Everything is synthetic nowadays. They spent the afternoon and evening preparing. Everything was ready half an hour before the guests were due. The place of honor in the center of the table was reserved for the birthday cake, a pyramid of almond paste rings. On the top of the cake was the tiny figure of a girl in a confirmation dress. Sophie was certain her mother had only put it there because Sophie had told her she was not sure she wanted to be confirmed. Her mother seemed to think the cake embodied the confirmation itself. The guests began to arrive. First came 3 of the girls from Sophie's class. Jeremy and David came. Sophie noticed that Joanna and Jeremy had already begun eyeing each other discreetly. Sophie received a philosophical dictionary as well as a diary with a lock. On the cover was written my personal philosophical thoughts. Joanna's parents drew up at the garden gate in a white Mercedes. Yes, it was a Barbie doll. We're only waiting for Alberto. They had been sitting at the table for half an hour when a middle-aged man with a black goatee and a beret came walking up Clover Close and in through the garden gate. He was carrying a bouquet of 15 red roses. Alberto. Sophie left the table and ran to greet him. She threw her arms around his neck and took the bouquet from him. He responded to the welcome by rooting around in his jacket pocket and drawing out a couple of Chinese firecrackers which he lit and tossed into the yard. As he approached the table, he lit a sparkler and set it on top of the almond pyramid. Then he went over and stood at the empty place between Sophie and her mother. Helene Amundsen said, "Let us also welcome Alberto Knox to this philosophical garden party. He is not my new boyfriend, because although my husband is so often away at sea, I don't have a new boyfriend for the time being. However, this astounding person is Sophie's new philosophy teacher. His prowess extends further than to setting off fireworks." Suddenly Joanna got up, walked determinedly over to Jeremy, and gave him a resounding kiss on the lips. He responded by trying to topple her backward over the table so as to get a better grip as he returned her kiss. "Not on the table, children," was Mrs. Amundsen's only comment. "Why not?" asked Alberto, turning toward her. "It's never wrong for a real philosopher to ask questions." A couple of the other boys who had not been kissed started to throw chicken bones up on the roof. "I think it's time to clear the plates away and serve the cake," said Mrs. Amundsen. "What made you kiss him?" Sophie said to Joanna. "I sat looking at his mouth and couldn't resist it. He is so cute." "How did it taste?" "Not exactly like I'd imagined, but..." Sophie's mother: "I only have this one daughter, and it is only this once that exactly 1 week and a day ago she reached the age of 15. As you see, we have spared no expense. There are 24 almond rings on the birthday cake, so there's at least one whole ring for each of you. Those who help themselves first can take 2 rings, because we start from the top and the rings get bigger and bigger as you go. That's the way it is in life too." When Sophie was a little girl, she went tripping around in tiny little rings. But as the years went by, the rings got bigger and bigger. Now they reach right over to the old town and back. And what is more, with a father who is at sea so much, she makes calls to all parts of the world. "We congratulate you on your 15th birthday, Sophie." One of the boys threw a firecracker up into the pear tree. Joanna left the table and pulled Jeremy up off his chair. They lay down on the grass and started kissing each other again. Sophie saw from a distance that Jeremy was trying to unbutton Joanna's white shirt, which was already covered with green stains from the grass. Sophie looked despairingly at Alberto. "It's happening more quickly than I thought," he said. "We have to get away from here as soon as possible. I just have to make a short speech." "Dear Sophie," he began. "Since this is a philosophical garden party, I will make a philosophical speech. In this riotous company, a dose of reason might not be out of place. But whatever happens, let us not forget to congratulate Sophie on her 15th birthday. During the past few weeks, Sophie and I have carried out a major philosophical investigation. We shall here and now reveal our findings. We shall reveal the innermost secrets of our existence. After a thorough philosophical study which has led from the first Greek philosophers to the present day, we have discovered that we are living our lives in the mind of a major who is at this moment serving as a UN observer in Lebanon. He has also written a book about us for his daughter back in Lille Sand. Her name is Hilda Mailer-Nag, and she was 15 years old on the same day as Sophie. The book about us lay on her bedside table when she woke up early on the morning of June 15th. To be more precise, it was in the form of a ring binder. Even as we speak, she can feel the final pages of the ring binder under her index finger. Our existence is therefore neither more nor less than a kind of birthday diversion for Hilda Mailer-Nag. We have all been invented as a framework for the major's philosophical education of his daughter. The poor UN major, who has just this minute sat down in the shade of a palm tree to avoid getting sunstroke. The days are hot in Lebanon, my friends. But the truth is that it is this garden party which is absolutely pure nonsense. The only dose of reason in the whole party is this speech. It is an existential catastrophe. For example, just take a look under the currant bushes and you will see what I mean. You cannot insure yourself against the collapse of your whole life. Neither can you insure yourself against the sun going out. There is not much more to say. When you have realized that you are a dream image in another person's sleepy consciousness, then, in my opinion, it is wisest to be silent. But I can finish by recommending that you take a short course in the history of philosophy. It is important to be critical of the older generation's values. If I have tried to teach Sophie anything, it is precisely that, to think critically. Hegel called it thinking negatively. The financial advisor. This agitator is attempting to break down all the sound values which the school and the church and we ourselves are trying to instill in the younger generation. It is they who have the future before them and who one day will inherit everything we have built up. If this man is not immediately removed from this gathering, I intend to call our lawyer. He will know how to deal with this situation. It makes little difference whether you deal with this situation or not, since you are nothing but a shadow. Anyway, Sophie and I are about to leave the party, since for us the philosophy course has not been purely theoretical. It has also had its practical side. When the time is ripe we will perform our disappearing act. That is how we are going to sneak our way out of the Major's consciousness. Don't forget what you have learned. It's this sort of nonsense we must liberate ourselves from. Your mother is a sweet and kind lady, just as the Little Red Riding Hood. That's why I have to do what he says, Mom. One day I had to leave you. I'm going to miss you, said her mother, but if there is a heaven over this one, you'll just have to fly. Neither you nor anyone else here will miss us for the simple reason that you do not exist. You are no more than shadows. That is the worst insult I've ever heard, Mrs. Ingebrigtsen burst out. If nothing else, we can always get him nailed for defamation of character. I'm sure he's a communist. He wants to strip us of everything we hold dear. The man's a scoundrel. Joanna's mom, I'm going to have a baby, she announced. All right, but you'll have to wait till you get home. Alberto looked down at Sophie with a somber expression. It's time. Then an uninvited guest arrived on a motorcycle with a crate of beer and bottles of aquavit strapped to the carrier. He grabbed a bottle of beer, drank it down, and set the empty bottle in the middle of the lawn. Then he went to the table and fetched the last 5 rings of the birthday cake. He showed the other guests how to throw the rings so they landed over the neck of the bottle. The death throes, said Alberto. We'd better get away before the Major ends it all and Hilda closes the ring binder. You'll have to clear up alone, Mom. It doesn't matter, child. This was no life for you. If Alberto can give you a better one, nobody will be happier than I. Didn't you tell me he had a white horse? This was once my little Garden of Eden, she said. And now you're being driven out of it, said Alberto. One of the boys was sitting in the white Mercedes. He revved the engine and the car smashed through the garden gate, up the gravel path, and down into the garden. She heard Alberto's voice. Now. At the same moment the white Mercedes crashed into an apple tree. Unripe fruit showered down onto the hood. That's going too far, shouted the financial advisor. I demand substantial compensation. It's that damned scoundrel's fault. Where is he? They have vanished into thin air, said Helene Amundsen, not without a touch of pride. She drew herself up to her full height, walked toward the long table and began to clear up after the philosophical garden party. Counterpoint. Hilda sat up in bed. That was the end of the story of Sophie and Alberto. But what had actually happened? Why had her father written that last chapter? Was it just to demonstrate his power over Sophie's world? She agreed with Alberto that the only sensible thing that had happened at the garden party was his speech. Surely her father didn't think Hilda's world was as chaotic as Sophie's garden party? Or that her world would also dissolve eventually? Was it up to Hilda herself to continue the story? Or had they really managed to sneak out of it? If Alberto and Sophie really had managed to sneak out of the story, there wouldn't be anything about it in the ring binder. Everything that was there, unfortunately, was clear to her father. Could there be anything written between the lines? There was more than a mere suggestion of it. Hilda realized that she would have to read the whole story again 1 or 2 more times. As the white Mercedes drove into the garden, Alberto dragged Sophie with him into the den. Then they ran into the woods in the direction of the Major's cabin. Quickly, cried Alberto. It's got to happen before he starts looking for us. Are we beyond the Major's reach now? We are in the borderland. They rowed across the water and ran into the cabin. Alberto opened a trapdoor in the floor. He pushed Sophie down into the cellar. Then everything went black. In the days that followed, Hilda worked on her plan. She sent several letters to Enkvamstel in Copenhagen. She also enlisted the aid of friends and acquaintances, and recruited almost half of her class at school. In between, she read Sophie's World. On Saturday, June 23, she awoke with a start around 9 o'clock. She knew her father had already left the camp in Lebanon. Later in the morning she began the preparations for Midsummer Eve with her mother. Sophie and Alberto seated themselves on a lawn in front of 2 large buildings. A young couple came walking out of one of the buildings. He was carrying a brown briefcase and she had a red handbag slung over one shoulder. A car drove along a narrow road in the background. We made it. This is Oslo. One of these buildings is called Chateau Neuf, which means the New Palace. People study music there. The other is the Congregation Faculty. It's a school of theology. Further up the hill they study science and up at the top they study literature and philosophy. Are we out of Hilda's book and beyond the Major's control? Yes, both. He'll never find us here. While the Major was busy crashing the financial advisor's car into an apple tree, we seized the chance to hide in the den. We were then at the embryo stage. We were of the old as well as of the new world. But concealing ourselves there was something the Major cannot possibly have envisaged. He would never have let us go so easily. As it was, it went like a dream. Of course, there's always the chance that he was in on it himself. It was he who started the white Mercedes. He may have exerted himself to the utmost to lose sight of us. He was probably utterly exhausted after everything that had been going on. She wanted someone to confirm what Alberto had said. She got up and went over to them. Excuse me, would you mind telling me the name of the street? But they ignored her completely. They can't hear me, she said desperately, and just as she said it, she recalled her dream about Hilda and the gold crucifix. It's the price we have to pay. Although we have sneaked out of a book, we can't expect to nave exactly the same status as its author. But we really are here. From now on, we will never be a day older than we were when we left the philosophical garden party. Does that mean we'll never have any real contact with people around us? A true philosopher never says never. This is the day Hilda's father gets back from Lebanon. That's why we must hurry. People walked right on by as if Sophie and Alberto were invisible. Cars were parked by the curbside all the way along the street. Alberto stopped by a small red convertible with the top down. This will do, he said. We must just make sure it's ours. It's a make-believe car, Sophie. It's just like us. People here only see a vacant space. That's all we have to confirm before we're on our way. A boy came cycling along on the sidewalk. He turned suddenly and rode right through the red car and onto the road. There, you see? It's ours. The key was in the ignition, he turned it, and the engine started. Is it true that no one can see us? Only people of our own kind. We might meet some of them. Major Albert Nag had just landed at Kastrup Airport outside Copenhagen. It was 4:30 on Saturday, June 23rd. He represented not only himself and his country. Albert Nag represented an international legal system, a century-old tradition that now embraced the entire planet. Major Albert Nag had a nearly 3-hour wait in the airport before his plane left for Kristiansand. He would have time to buy a few presents for his family. He had sent the present of his life to Hilda 2 weeks ago. This is a personal call for Albert Nag. Albert Nag is requested to contact the SAS information desk. Here is a message for you. It is urgent. He opened the envelope at once. It contained a short note. Dear Dad, welcome home from Lebanon. As you can imagine, I can't even wait till you get home. Forgive me for having you paged over the loudspeakers. It was the easiest way. P.S. Unfortunately, a claim for damages has arrived from financial advisor Ingebrigtsen regarding a stolen and wrecked Mercedes. P.S. I may be sitting in the garden when you get here. But you might also be hearing from me before that. P.S. I'm rather scared of staying in the garden too long at a time. It's so easy to sink into the ground in such places. Love from Hilda, who has had plenty of time to prepare your homecoming. Major Albert Nag's first impulse was to smile. But he did not appreciate being manipulated in this manner. He had always liked to be in charge of his own life. He was just about to enter the Danish food deli when he noticed a small envelope. Dear Dad, please buy a large Danish salami, preferably a 2-pound one, and Mom would probably like a cognac sausage. P.S. Danish caviar is not bad either. Love, Hilda. Suddenly the UN observer began to feel himself observed. It was as if someone was in remote control of everything he did. When he got to the store that sold electrical appliances, he saw that there was an envelope taped to the window there too. Dear Dad, Sophie sends her greetings and thanks for the combined mini TV and FM radio that she got for her birthday from her very generous father. P.S. In case you haven't been there yet, there are further instructions at the Danish food store and the big tax-free store that sells wines and tobacco. P.S. I got some money for my birthday, so I can contribute to the mini TV with 350 crowns. Love, Hilda, who has already stuffed the turkey and made the Waldorf salad. A mini TV cost 985 Danish crowns. That could certainly be called a bagatelle in comparison with how Albert Nag felt about being directed hither and thither by his daughter's sneaky tricks. Was she here or was she not? Was he not being deprived of his basic human rights? He felt obliged to go into the tax-free store as well. All I need from here is a bag of gumdrops and some marzipan bars. P.S. You must keep all your senses alert the whole way home. You wouldn't want to miss any important messages, would you? At gate 28 he caught sight of another white envelope. It won't be long now. As he handed over his boarding pass he tore off another white envelope that had been taped to the check-in desk. Sophie and Alberto had passed Breivik. It's almost 9 o'clock. He'll soon be landing at Kajavik. But we won't be stopped for speeding. It makes no difference, Sophie. Can't you get it into your head? So saying, he swung the car into the woods and drove straight through the trees. That only means we're spirits of the air compared to our surroundings. No, now you're putting the cart before the horse. It is the reality around us that's an airy adventure to us. It is a widespread misunderstanding that spirit is a thing that is more airy than vapor. On the contrary, spirit is more solid than ice. Once upon a time there was a man who didn't believe in angels. One day, while he was out working in the woods, he was visited by an angel. They walked together for a while. Then the man turned to the angel and said, "All right, now I have to admit that angels exist. But you don't exist in reality, like us." "What do you mean by that?" asked the angel. So the man answered, "When we came to that big rock, I had to go around it, but I noticed that you just glided through it. And when we came to that huge log that lay across the path, I had to climb over it while you walked straight through it." The angel was very surprised, and said, "Didn't you also notice that we took a path that led through a marsh? We both walked right through the mist. That was because we were more solid than the mist. It's the same with us, Sophie. Spirit can pass through steel doors. No tanks or bombers can crush anything that is of spirit. I could really use a cup of coffee." Alberto was trying to tap coffee into a paper cup he had found in the car. He only had to press a lever, but even by exerting all his strength he could not press it down. This made him so mad that he turned to the cafeteria guests and asked for help. No one reacted. An old woman got up from her chair and came toward them. She went up to Alberto and said, My, how you do yell, my boy. You want some coffee, you said. Welcome to eternity then, children. And you? I'm out of one of Grimm's fairy tales. They came through the trees to a small clearing. There were Snow White and some of the 7 dwarfs, Mary Poppins and Sherlock Holmes, Peter Pan and Pippi Longstocking, Little Red Riding Hood and Cinderella. What a lot of noise, exclaimed Alberto. That's because it's midsummer, said the old woman. We haven't had a gathering like this since Valborg's Eve. That was when we were in Germany. I'm only here on a short visit. Was it coffee you wanted? Sophie noticed that all the buildings were made out of gingerbread, candy, and sugar icing. Several of the figures were eating directly off the facades. Why are you in a hurry? Alberto explained their errand, and the old woman commented, I must say, you certainly are a pair of greenhorns. You'd better hurry up and cut the umbilical cord to your mortal progenitor. We no longer need their world. We belong to the invisible people. They soon arrived in Lillesand. SK 876 from Copenhagen touched down at Kajavik on schedule at 9:35 p.m. The note inside read, Dear Dad, you probably thought I would turn up in Copenhagen. But my control over your movements is more ingenious than that. I can see you wherever you are, Dad. The fact is, I have been to visit a well-known gypsy family which many years ago sold a magic brass mirror to great-grandmother. I have also gotten myself a crystal ball. At this very moment, I can see that you have just sat down in your seat. I wish you a pleasant flight. Love, your own witch daughter, Queen of the Mirror and the highest protector of irony. He had been given a taste of his own medicine. But with a significant difference, surely. His medicine had first and foremost affected Sophie and Alberto. And they were only imaginary. Standing in the arrival hall at Kajavik Airport. A demonstration was there to greet him. They were holding signs saying, Welcome home, Dad. Hilda is waiting in the garden. Irony lives. The worst thing was that he could not just jump into a taxi. He had to wait for his baggage. Then one of the girls came up and gave him a bunch of roses and he melted. He dug down into one of his shopping bags and gave each demonstrator a marzipan bar. A young man stepped forward and explained that he was under the command of the Queen of the Mirror, and that he had orders to drive him to Berkeley. The other demonstrators dispersed into the crowd. They drove out onto the E18. Every bridge and tunnel they passed was draped with banners saying, Welcome home, the turkey is ready, I can see you, Dad. When he was dropped off outside the gate at Berkeley, his wife was waiting for him outside the house. After a long embrace, he asked, Where is she? She's sitting on the dock, Albert. Alberto and Sophie stopped the red convertible on the square in Lillesand outside the Hotel Norge. We'll have to hurry. I want to get there before he arrives. A useful clue was that Berkeley lay by the water. Suddenly Sophie shouted, There it is. We've found it? I do believe you're right, but don't shout so loud. Why? There's no one to hear us. My dear Sophie, after a whole course in philosophy, I'm very disappointed to find you still jumping to conclusions. They drove through the gate and up the gravel path to the house. A little way down the garden a table was set for 3. I can see her, whispered Sophie. She's sitting down on the dock, just like in my dream. Have you noticed how much the garden looks like your own garden in Clover Close? Yes, it does. With the glider and everything. Can I go down to her? Naturally. I'll stay here. She sat down politely beside her. Sophie tried to talk to her even though she knew it was useless. Hilda, it's Sophie. Hilda gave no sign that she had heard. Sophie sat still now. It felt good just to be close to Hilda. Then she heard the deep voice of a man, Hilda. It was the major in uniform, with a blue beret. He stood at the top of the garden. Hilda jumped up and ran toward him. They met between the glider and the red convertible. He lifted her up in the air and swung her around and around. Hilda had been sitting on the dock waiting for her father. She looked at her watch again. Now it was 10:15. He could be arriving any minute. But what was that? She thought she heard a faint breath of something, exactly as in her dream about Sophie. She turned around quickly. There was something, she was sure of it. But what? For a few seconds she was afraid she was hearing things. Hilda. Now she turned the other way. It was Dad. He was standing at the top of the garden. Hilda jumped up and ran toward him. They met by the glider. He lifted her up in the air and swung her around and around. Hilda was crying, and her father had to hold back his tears as well. You've become a grown woman, Hilda. And you've become a real writer. Hilda wiped away her tears. Then they had to go over the ring binder and the story of Sophie and Alberto from one end to the other and backwards and forwards. SHH. What is it? Didn't you hear it? Something squeaking. No. Her father said, but the philosophy course isn't quite over. It isn't. Tonight I'm going to tell you about the universe. When Hilda jumped up and ran toward her father, Sophie felt her tears welling up. She would never be able to reach her. Sophie was deeply envious of Hilda because she had been created a real person of flesh and blood. Alberto honked the car horn. Didn't Hilda do exactly the same? Have you been crying? She's so lucky to be a real person. Now she'll grow up and be a real woman. I'm sure she'll have real children too. But there are two sides to everything. That was what I tried to teach you at the beginning of our course. But she who wins the lot of life must also draw the lot of death, since the lot of life is death. But still, isn't it better to have had a life than never to have really lived? We cannot live a life like Hilda or like the Major for that matter. On the other hand, we'll never die. We are the invisible people. Perhaps what I envy most about Hilda is all this, her family life. But you have a family yourself. And you have a cat, 2 birds, and a tortoise. But we left all that behind, didn't we? By no means. It's only the Major who left it behind. He has written the final word of his book, my dear, and he will never find us again. Does that mean we can go back? Anytime we want. But we're also going to make new friends in the woods behind Cinderella's cafeteria. The Big Bang. Her father broke the silence. It's a strange thought that we live on a tiny little planet in the universe. The distances are so great that we measure them in light minutes and light years. A light minute is the distance light travels in 1 minute. And that's a long way, because light travels through space at 300,000 kilometers a second. That means that a light minute is 60 times 300,000 or 18 million kilometers. A light year is nearly 10 trillion kilometers. How far away is the Sun? It's a little over 8 light minutes away. Pluto, which is the planet farthest out in our solar system, is about 5 light hours away from us. When an astronomer looks at Pluto through his telescope, he is in fact looking 5 hours back in time. Our own Sun is one of 400 billion other stars in the galaxy we call the Milky Way. With our Sun situated in one of its several spiral arms. When we look up at the sky on a clear winter's night, we see a broad band of stars. This is because we are looking toward the center of the Milky Way. The distance to the star in the Milky Way that is our nearest neighbor is 4 light years. The whole galaxy or nebula, as we also call it, is 90,000 light years wide. When we gaze at a star in the Milky Way which is 50,000 light years away from our Sun, we are looking back 50,000 years in time. We can never know what the universe is like now. We only know what it was like then. But everything we see meets the eye in the form of light waves. And these light waves take time to travel through space. We could compare it to thunder. We always hear the thunder after we have seen the lightning. That's because sound waves travel slower than light waves. It's the same thing with the stars. When I look at a star that is thousands of light years away, I'm seeing the peal of thunder from an event that lies thousands of years back in time. Astronomers say there are about 100 billion of such galaxies in the universe, and each of these galaxies consists of about 100 billion stars. We call the nearest galaxy to the Milky Way the Andromeda Nebula. It lies 2 million light years from our own galaxy. The most distant galaxies we know of today are about 10 billion light-years away from us. When we receive signals from these galaxies, we are going 10 billion years back in the history of the universe. That's about twice as long as our own solar system has existed. Apparently no galaxy in space remains where it is. All the galaxies in the universe are moving away from each other at colossal speeds. The further they are away from us, the quicker they move. That means that the distance between the galaxies is increasing all the time. The universe is expanding. Expanding universe can only have one explanation. Once upon a time, about 15 billion years ago, all substance in the universe was assembled in a relatively small area. The substance was so dense that gravity made it terrifically hot. Finally it got so hot and so tightly packed that it exploded. We call this explosion the Big Bang. The Big Bang caused all the substance in the universe to be expelled in all directions, and as it gradually cooled, it formed stars and galaxies and moons and planets. It's expanding precisely because of this explosion billions of years ago. The universe has no timeless geography. The universe is a happening. The universe is an explosion. You may recall that Alberto told Sophie about the two forces that cause the planets to remain in constant orbit round the sun. Weren't they gravity and inertia? Right, and the same thing applies to the galaxies. Because even though the universe continues to expand, the force of gravity is working the other way. And one day, in a couple of billion years, gravity will perhaps cause the heavenly bodies to be packed together again as the force of the huge explosion begins to weaken. Then we would get a reverse explosion, a so-called implosion. But the distances are so great that it will happen like a movie that is run in slow motion. You might compare it with what happens when you release the air from a balloon. Will all the galaxies be drawn together in a tight nucleus again? Either the universe will go on expanding forever so that the galaxies will draw further and further apart, or the universe will begin to contract again. How heavy and massive the universe is will determine what happens. It may be that the expansion of the universe is something that will only happen this one time. But if it keeps on expanding for all eternity, the question of where it all began becomes even more pressing. For a Christian, it would be obvious to see the Big Bang as the actual moment of creation. In the Orient they have a cyclic view of history. And they can compare with the great paradox of eternity that Sophie once sat pondering in her garden. Either the universe has always been there or it suddenly came into existence out of nothing. Hilda clapped her hand to her forehead. What was that? I think I've just been stung by a gadfly. Sophie and Alberto had been sitting in the red convertible listening to the Major tell Hilda about the universe. Has it struck you that our roles are completely reversed? Asked Alberto after a while. Before it was they who listened to us, and we couldn't see them. Now we're listening to them and they can't see us. When we started, we didn't know about the other reality that Hilda and the Major inhabited. Now they don't know about ours. But the Major could intervene in our world. Our world was nothing but his interventions. I haven't yet relinquished all hope that we may also intervene in their world. She opened the glove compartment and found a wrench. She grabbed it and jumped out of the car. Finally she raised the wrench above her head and crashed it down on Hilda's forehead. Ouch, said Hilda. Then Sophie hit the Major on his forehead, but he didn't react at all. What was that? He asked. I think I've just been stung by a gadfly. There's a chilly breeze coming up, said Hilda. You remember Alberto and his secret plan? They simply disappeared from the garden party. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. Yes, but... into thin air. The story had to end somewhere. It was just something I wrote. That was, yes, but not what happened afterward. Suppose they were here. I can feel it, Dad. Sophie ran back to the car. You wrote that there was something between the lines. Perhaps there is something between the lines in this garden too. Phosphorescence and all other organisms are made of elements that were once blended together in a star. Yes, we too are stardust. Everything we can see in the sky is a cosmic fossil from thousands and millions of years ago. The only thing an astrologer can do is predict the past. If it's a clear night, we can see millions, even billions of years back into the history of the universe. So in a way, we are going home. You and I also began with the Big Bang, because all substance in the universe is an organic unity. Once in a primeval age all matter was gathered in a clump so enormously massive that a pinhead weighed many billions of tons. This primeval atom exploded because of the enormous gravitation. It was as if something disintegrated. When we look up at the sky, we are trying to find the way back to ourselves. All the stars and galaxies in the universe are made of the same substance, they all have the same origin. All stars and all planets belong to the same family. But what is this earthly substance? That is the big question. For we ourselves are of that substance. We are a spark from the great fire that was ignited many billions of years ago. However, we must not exaggerate the importance of these figures. It is enough just to hold a stone in your hand. The universe would have been equally incomprehensible if it had only consisted of that one stone the size of an orange. The question would be just as impenetrable, where did the stone come from? Sophie, I want to try the rowboat, she said. It's tied up. And we would never be able to lift the oars. Shall we try? We've got plenty of time. A true philosopher must never give up. If we could just get it loose. There are more stars now, said Hilda. Do you remember the night before you left for Lebanon? It was New Year's Day. That was when I decided to write a book about philosophy for you. It's as if we are sitting at the very tip of the fine hairs in the white rabbit's fur. I wonder if there is anyone out there in the night of the light years. The rowboat has worked itself loose. So it has. I don't understand it. I went down and checked it just before you got here. Did you? It reminds me of when Sophie borrowed Alberto's boat. Do you remember how it lay drifting out in the lake? I bet it's her at work again. Go ahead and make fun of me. All evening, I've been able to feel someone here. One of us will have to swim out to it. We'll both go, Dad. The end.